Hey folks, Dennis here with the Living Soil Community and the Las Vegas Worm Farm. And it's that time of the week. It's our worm topic of the week. And this week what we're talking about is, you guessed it. No, it's not worms, but you almost guessed it. We're going to talk about why worm castings aren't working. Why do the worm castings you bought not do anything? That's what we're going to talk about this week. Most people think worm castings don't work because they're using them like fertilizer. Hmm. But Dennis, aren't worm castings fertilizers? Hmm. No, I would consider them more of a soil amendment, not a fertilizer. Well, because it's helping build the soil, you're amending the soil. You're not necessarily just adding nutrients to the soil. We talk about this in some of our other videos, but today, what I want to kind of look at is when you use worm castings like fertilizers, you're not going to get the best result out of them. And the reason for that is because think about if I take, let's take your dog or your cat or your pet. I take them and we drop them off into the Sahara Desert. Will they survive? Will they thrive? Will they make it? If your animals are like mine, absolutely not. They're just not. They're not gonna make it. They're gonna take a couple of steps, sit down, and be like, well, I'll just stay here and wait for my owner to show up and tell me what I need to do, where I need to go. So, more than likely, your pets aren't gonna make it if we pick them up and drop them off in the Sahara Desert. If we take worm castings and take the bag or the box or whatever they come in and we pour them on our soil that's dry, that's dead, compacted, and expect them to do something, it's not going to happen. They don't work like that. There's something that we have to consider when we're looking at the worm castings in order for them to do what they're supposed to. I like to look at worm castings as part of a living soil, right? And when we talk about a living soil, we talk about four principles, which is air, water, food, and microbes, right? Microbes are the worm castings. So why are do I consider worm castings not a fertilizer? Because when we look at the NPK or the amount of nutrients that are actually in the bag of worm castings, there's really not that many when we get them when you look at them, right? If you go to the store and you got an NPK rating on it, it's usually like 0.000 or zero point 0.5, zero point 0.5, zero point 0.5. It's extremely low, which means that there's not a lot of nutrients available in that bag. So what are you actually buying when you buy worm casting? Oh, crazy thing, right? It's not nutrients because compost will actually have more nutrients in it than worm castings. And if you look at some of the chemical fertilizers that are out there, they'll have more nutrients in the compost, right? So when you look at the NPK ratings on bags, compost usually sits, depending on where you get it or where you get it from. These are all rough averages because every compost and every worm casting is different, right? But usually compost will sit somewhere between like a 3 and a 5. It'll be 3, 5, 3, 3, 3, 3, 5, 5, 5, 6, 6, right? They're pretty low. But if you look at some of the other fertilizers out there, I mean, we get up to 10, 10, 10, 15, 15, 15, 30, 30, 30, 40, 40, 40, right? We get really high in some of these numbers. That's because all of that is just NPK in that bag. There's nothing else in that bag. So when we're looking at worm castings, we're looking at not the nutrients that are in it, but the biological life that you're buying. Worms are called micro factories for a reason, right? So when we're buying worm castings, we're buying their biology. And if we take that biology and we take it out and we go back to the Sahara Desert where we have our pets, right? And we drop the worm castings there, what's going to happen to that biology? The same thing that's going to happen to our pets. They're going to die. They're not going to do anything and they're just going to be destroyed by the sunlight and the elements that are around it. And the same thing happens for our worm castings. If we drop biology into that environment that's not hospitable for them, they're not going to make it. And they're not going to be able to cycle or do anything that they're supposed to or that they would usually do, which gave them the name black gold, right? Gold is very valuable. And while worm castings aren't gold, they are black. So they are black gold because they're extremely valuable in what they bring to the table. No, I did not give them the name black gold. That's just something that I've heard black worm castings being called for a very long time. So how do we make sure that when we get these worm castings that they do what they're supposed to? Well, there's a couple of things to consider before we even get to using them. It is getting them. Remember, we're buying biology here that's in a bag, and you guys know that I will always push locally produced worm castings or regionally produced worm castings. Excuse me. Excuse me. And the fresher, the better, right? Not more is better, but fresher is better. So I will always push those first. So locally locally created, locally sourced, and then freshness is the bestest. So the fresher it is, the better it is. Once we get past those things, then it's utilization of the actual product. And usually I will tell you guys to follow the manufacturer's guidelines on the bag. And if the bag says that you top dress with worm castings, you will want to not listen to that. Okay. It's back to the Sahara Desert, right? When we use worm castings, the best way to use them is to use them as close as possible to the roots. So there's a few things that these worm castings need, just like every other living organism, right? Animal in the desert. Worm castings need air. If your soil is compacted, if it's hard like this, and you can't stick your finger through it, like here in Vegas, it's probably compacted, which means that there's no oxygen getting into that soil. You can add as much worm castings as you want. Those microbes are going to die as soon as they get covered up because there's not enough oxygen for them to be able to breathe. You got to be able to open that soil up before you add the worm castings in order for those guys to get enough oxygen and survive. The next thing is if your soil is dry, that compaction, right? Most of the time kicks out all of the oxygen and it makes moisture just run off the surface. I know a lot of you guys in arid climates, or if you've ever had a pot that you've left the soil in for a very long period of time and you try to hydrate it and the water just kind of wicks off and wicks away, that's a hydrophobic soil. Compaction can also cause this, right? And that means that water will not infiltrate and the organic material won't hold that moisture. So if there's no moisture there, those microbes are going to die. Why? Well, microbes don't have a skin. They don't have an exoskeleton. They don't have hard bodies like us to be able to keep the moisture inside, at least for a little while. Microbes are very sensitive to a lot of different things. Moisture is one of those. And if you take that moisture away, the moisture literally gets sucked out of their body and they die. No more microbes, all dead. So when we sprinkle worm castings on top and the sun hits it and dries it out and there's no moisture, there's no microbes. You've got a very expensive dirt now. The next thing, when we talk about microorganisms or living things, we got to keep them alive. If we take those microbes, our pets are still in the Sahara Desert, right? If we give them air, they'll be okay, right? If we give them water, it's now a better environment for them, right? It's still extremely harsh and they need other things, right? And one of those other things would be a food source, right? Microbes are no different. Worm castings are no different. You have to give them a food source in order for them to be able to eat that food to create nutrients for your plants, which is called cycling nutrients. They have to have food to be able to eat. They have to have food to eat so that they can produce nutrients for your plants. So we got to have enough organic material in the soil. If you have no organic material, you don't know how much organic material you have in your soil. And then you got to get that established beforehand before you get the worm castings into that environment, or else they will die. If we take our pets and put them into the desert without all of the things that they need, they will die. Your worm castings will die too. They will do the exact same thing as any other animal because that's what you're buying when you're buying worm castings. And the next thing, one of the last four principles is the microbes that we need in living soil, and the worm castings are those microbes. Again, we're buying living, breathing things when we get black gold. We purchase worm castings. So we don't really want them in a bag that's been sealed with no air in it because we already talked about we need air. So if the bag's sealed and we get it from a store that's been sitting on the shelf for who knows how long, there's probably no oxygen in there, which means that a lot of those microbes have probably died off. The second thing is moisture. If you get worm castings or you get, when you get worm castings and you go to grab them and they're dry, microbes are probably dead because there's no moisture in there to keep those guys alive, right? Remember, they need air, water, and food. So there's no air, there's no water in that bag, and it's all dried up. They're not alive. It's an expensive bag of dirt that you purchased at that point. And then there's got to be a food source. And hopefully you have that food source inside of your soil when you add those worm castings or you add them to your seed mix or wherever you're putting them so that they can continue to do what they are meant to do out in nature, which is produce food for your plants. These are the things that you have to have in place in order to get the worm castings to do what they have to. So it's not that the worm castings didn't work, right? The pets And the animals, the cats and dogs, they're alive. They can be pets and animals. But if you put them in the Sahara Desert, they're gonna die. They're not gonna be able to survive there. And the same thing with the worm castings. They work and they're alive, and they do what they're supposed to do. But if you take them and you move them into an environment that's not conducive to keeping them alive, they're gonna die. One of the biggest myths that are out there is that worm castings are like instant plant boosters. Like it just, wow, it just makes it work like that. Now, there are some soluble nutrients inside of worm castings, right? And sometimes that will happen, but it's not like a normal chemical fertilizer that's feeding NPK. Okay. They're not an energy drink. They're more like a long term support system for the soil, right? What they're going to do is they're going to find a home, they're going to multiply, they're going to break down organic material regularly on a regular basis. And as they do that, they'll be feeding the plant the entire time. You don't have to worry about it. You just have to make sure that you keep those guys alive. If this sounds like a different way of growing, it is. It's different. In a chemical system, we usually just feed NPK, and that's all we're worried about. And when the granules disappear, or when the bag says that we need a refeed, then we refeed. In a living soil system where we're using, or an organic system where we're using worm castings, we're worried about the biology in the soil and keeping those guys alive and keeping them fed so that they can feed the plant. It's a different thought process. It's a different way of growing. So if you've ever bought worm casting and you're like, hey man, these didn't work, it's probably because the conditions they were thrown in weren't conducive to keep them alive and keep them doing what they're supposed to. The best thing I can tell you is never top dress with worm castings. You're exposing them to the elements, you're exposing them to the sunlight, and all of that is going to kill them. The wind is going to dry them out, and then again, no water, they're going to die. The best thing you can do with worm castings is get them as close as possible to the roots so that they can do all the work that they need to for the plant. And then you will see the benefits of black gold and what they actually bring to the table. Couple of other things that I want to tell you guys when it comes to worm castings. First, don't expose them to sunlight uh, or excessive temperatures, right? They're living things just like us, so keep the temperature roughly nice. That's a bad word to say, bad way to say it. Keep the temperatures in the garage is fine, but outside, exposed to the sun in a bag, not okay, right? A lot of the stores, when they get pallets and pallets of different type of amendments and compost, they will stack them outside, leave them in the sun, and the sun just bakes them. We don't want that, okay? We don't want them to dry out. So no sun exposure. We don't want them to dry out. So if you have a bag and you have a little bit of leftover, first of all, you shouldn't have any leftover. But if you do, keep that bag sealed, keep it closed as much as possible so that we can keep some of that moisture in there. Don't seal it completely. Remember, we need air, but we want to keep it moist there as well. So we can come back and add water to it every now and then to kind of keep it hydrated and keep it going the way it's supposed to. Uh, don't buy a lot. I would rather you buy less than not enough. And the reason for that is if we leave a bag of worm castings and we leave it out for an extended period of time, like season over season over season, and we come back and try to use it, more than likely a lot of those microbes have probably died off. So it's better to buy little and then need more and go buy as needed. Because again, this goes back to if it's fresh, it's better. The fresher, the better, right? The fresher the worm castings are, the more biology is there, the better it is for all the nutrient cycling and all of everything that your plant would ever need, right? So we want it as fresh as possible. So buy less. Yes, it's crazy. And then the next thing is I want you to also use less. A lot of people, when they're using fertilizers, just anything in general, I'm bad at it. Like I'm heavy-handed when it comes to certain things, right? Like it says put 2 tablespoons of chocolate syrup in my milk. I'm going with 4 because I think more is better. And I can tell you that's great in some instances and terrible when it comes to black gold and worm castings. More is not enough. More is not better. And the reason for that is some of the growth inhibitors that are inside of them. So there's been enough tests out there. You can go look at what was it, North Carolina State. I believe that was them. There's a bunch of other ones that if you go above about 20-25%, depending on the type of worm castings, you will actually get diminishing. It will actually stump the growth of your plants and it could actually be detrimental. So don't want to do that. Look at the manufacturer's bag and go based off of their recommendations, right? If you're using worm castings that we produce, then I'm going to tell you right around 10%. Don't go over that. But more is not better. That is the other thing that I want to tell you guys. More is not better. Fresher is better, but more is not better. And the next thing is, I think that's it. I don't think I have anything else for you guys. Yeah, worm castings. Not really a fertilizer, more of a soil amendment because they're amending the soil and producing nutrients for your plants. They're not feeding your plants directly. It's just not how they work. And if somebody's telling you that they are, I would tell them to go look at some of the science that's out there, some of the microbiology, the things that happen in the rhizosphere of a plant, and see what's actually going on when we add worm castings or what's inside of worm castings and how that actually affects the plant. A lot of science out there with AI these days. Everything's at your fingertips. It really is. But if you're using worm castings and they haven't been working for you, it's probably because the conditions in your soil weren't conducive to be able to get those guys to do what they're supposed to. If you made it this far and you find this type of stuff interesting, go ahead and give this a like, share, or comment down below. And that's going to be it for this week. And we'll see y'all next week. Bye, folks.